Okay, so we left over a small piece before the Mishnah over here on Chesamid Beis. We're in the middle of the discussion. The discussion was that we just learned, how do we know, the Gemara wanted to know, for where do we know that a person who is musgar, which means he was not declared tamei, we're waiting to see whether the signs, whether they're going to spread out, or it's the lesion, the tumor, whether the sign of tsaras is going to spread out. That's the mitzvah musgar. So where do we know that he has to be also outside, that you have to send them away? And the Gemara says, because it says Yemei Kol Yemei, should have just said all days. It should have said the days, and it says all days. So that is coming to include that even a Mitzorah Musgar, even though this sending out is only written by a Mitzorah Muchlot, somebody who was decidedly Tamei declared, but because the pasuk says Kol Yemei, an extra inclusion, so we include the rabbis Mitzorah Musgar l'shiluach. So the Gemara jumps on this idea that you said that there's an extra pasuk of Kol Yemei, and that's why, even though the Torah does not write this by the Mitzorah Musgar, but you're saying this is written, Kol Yemei is written by the Mitzorah Muchlot. But since it says Kol Yemei, we're including it. So the Gemara wants to know, so then why don't we also include it and say that a Mitzorah Musgar should also bring the birds, also require the haircut? By a Mitzorah Muchlot, one who was decidedly Tomei, when he becomes Toher, the Torah prescribes that he must shave off his hair and he must bring some birds as a korban. But so a korban, and you dip it in the thing, one of them flies away, but there is birds over there. But we don't do that process when it comes to a mitzvah which is only musgar, where she's confined. We don't do that. So after the confinement, if he goes out, we don't do that. But since you just said Kol Yemei is including even those laws which are written by the Mitzorah Musgar, we're applying it. I mean, the laws, even the laws that are written by Mitzorah Muchlot, we're applying it to a Mitzorah Musgar, because there's a by the Mitzorah Muchlot that says Kol Yemei, Frag the Gemara. This is what we're up to. In that case, Frag the Gemara, Taglachas v'tziporim amaylo. So why would there not be also the shaving and the birds by the muchlat at the end of when he becomes tahir? We bring birds and we also take a shave, but that doesn't apply. How come we don't, my time alloy, why should we not bring birds and have him shave even by a musgar? Since we have a pasuk Kol Yemei, basically we should include also the musgar, just as you do for the aspect of sending him away and to be metame bibia. We say that we include a mitzvah that is musgar, because the Torah says Kol Yemei. So why don't we my time alloy? So what is the reason why we shouldn't take, it didn't need to require a shave and bring the birds for the Mitzoira who is Musgar. And then after it, we should do that. How do we know we don't? The Katani, because what is it said in the Mishnah? The Mishnah said, Ein bein toher mitoich hezger, that it does no difference to one who becomes clean after being confined, mitoich hezger, which means Ein bein toher mitoich hezger b'mei rifu osei, when he's pure, when he's clean, when you say that he's clear, which means after you let him go, you take him out of confinement. The Mishnah said, so it makes no difference between whether you get clean after you were confined, or litoher mitoich hechlet, or you get clean from when you were determined to be tamei. And the only difference, the Mishnah says, Elo taglachas v'tziporim, only the shaving and the birds. So that says clearly that mitoich hezger, you don't bring the birds and you don't shave, because that's the difference between becoming clean from when you're being confined or from becoming clean from when you were determined to be tamei. The only difference. So that means that when you become clean from confinement, you don't bring birds, you don't shave. How come we don't include it from the kol yimei like you did before? Now Rashi is going to explain over here. The truth is, the matter is, by a real mitzoira, there are two steps. And first of all, at the day that he becomes clean, he brings the birds and he takes a shave. That's the day that he becomes clean, that he's healed from, meaning a mitzoira that was muchlat. So when he becomes clean, he has to shave, and then he also has to bring the birds. Then he has to wait 7 days, and then on the 8th day, there is additional things to do. There's a karbonis of a osham, a lake shaman. Now the Gemara does not address that or try to say that you should also need oil, you should need an osham by a mitzoira who's musgar, because that's a whole different, that's on the 8th day. We're talking about these things that you do to the mitzoira, the one who was declared the musgar, at the time that he becomes clean. Those things should apply to the musgar as well, from the mukhla. But we're not talking about, there are more stuff done to the mukhla which are done the 8th day. That's, of course, doesn't apply here. Let's look at the Rashi. The toir mitoich hechlet elo taglachas v'tziporim. So the only difference is that the one who becomes clean, this is on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the one who becomes clean after he was determined to be tamei brings the birds and shaves. Taglachas v'tziporim. But really, there's other differences, because on the 8th day, the one that comes hechlet, he would also bring a karbonis. So the Gemara says we're not discussing that. The af al gav the ika karbonis, osham v'loik shaman, even though there are karbonis and osham v'loik shaman. By whom? We're talking about the mitoich hechlet. So why does the Mishnah not say there's more differences? It's different than I said, not the question. It's on the statement of the Mishnah. Why did the Mishnah say that the only difference is that the one who was determined to be tamei is going to have to shave and bring birds? But there's more differences. There's karbonis of the osham. He has to bring a korban osham, and he has to bring a jug of oil. That's in addition. So Rashi explains that this is not what we're discussing. Here we're talking about what takes place. We're saying a difference when they become healed. Either you go out of confinement or you go out of healed from the tumah. The difference is that when you're healed from tumah, you shave and you bring birds. When you go out of confinement, you don't bring the birds and you don't shave. But there's other things. We're discussing over here at the day that you're becoming clean and you're becoming healed. We're not discussing the karbanis which is on the 8th. So yes, there's more differences. A mitzvah which is only confined will not bring the other karbanis, not the osham, not the likshaman. But that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. The Mishnah is talking about from the karbanis that the muchlat, that one who's healed, brings at the 7 as soon as he's healed. So over there he brings the birds and he shaves. That doesn't apply to the muskar. But in any event, we still see this is just almost seem that this Rashi should belong right on the Mishnah, because Rashi is explaining a detail of the Mishnah, why the Mishnah is only discussing taglachas v'tziporim and not mentioning the karbonos oshem v'loy. Almost seems like there should be a commentary on the Mishnah, but the Gemara by us it's on the Gemara. But what is the Gemara's question here? The Gemara is asking now, why don't we include and why don't we say that a mitzvah who becomes out of confinement should also shave and bring birds, because the pasuk says kol yemei. Just like you're saying that you're going to send them away is for the kol yemei, why don't we do that also with regards to shaving and the birds? Omar Abayes answers Abaye. Omar Kro, because the verse clearly says that the shaving and the birds come as a result from his being cured. A person who is confined and then he goes out of confinement, it's not that he has been cured. That just tells us that the days of confinement that we found out that he's not really sick. And the Torah gives us, you have to wait 7 days and another 7 days just to see what happens. So yes, he's confined, and yes, there is laws of Tumah over there, but still, in this particular pasuk, in which it says that you have to bring the birds and he has to shave, over there we're talking about because he has been healed from his leprosy. So since it's talking about very clearly that he's been healed from his leprosy, only situation where you're healed from leprosy required to bring the birds and require shaving. But by a musgar who was confined, since he never got healed, so therefore we cannot apply the law of the birds and the shaving to the musgar, to the confined person. Omar Abaye, says Abaye. Omar Kro, the pasuk says, the Kohen goes outside of the camp. He goes to visit the muchlat, the one who has the leprosy. And behold, the negat saras has been healed. Look in the pasuk over here, in number 8, the Yotza HaKoyen. Yotza HaKoyen al Mechutz LaMachane. You see where I'm pointing? Bero HaKoyen, the nirpo negat saras was healed, minat zarua. So the pasuk continues with Tziva HaKoyen. So the Kohen instructs, V'lokach lamitayir states Tziporim chayis tohiris. You take for the one who's being cleaned 2 live birds, tohiris, ve'etz eres, v'shnisolas, ve'ezov. So you see that this specifically relates to the case where nirpa nega tzaras minat tzarua, that the tzaras has been healed. But if he was only a musgar, it didn't heal. It just goes out. It didn't spread out. So therefore, and after the negatzaras, the pasuk says, so therefore we say like this: one whose leprosy hinges on being healed, nirpa. Yotzozeh, this would include the musgar She'ain tzaratoi tluya b'refuos ela b'yomim. His leprosy does not hinge on medicine. He's not healed. It's just the days. The Torah has 7 days you have to wait, and therefore we're not going to apply the case of the halacha of tzipor chayes toiros. So while the pasuk kol yimei would include for the inyan shiluach to send them away, but this specific pasuk what talks about the taglachas, the shaving and the birds, that only applies when it is vihine nirpa nega tzaraz that he was healed. But in this case, by a muskar, he wasn't healed. He just has to wait the days. Tzaraita tluya b'refuos has to bring the birds. But one who's only depends on the days does not have to bring the birds and does not need to shave. Okay, makes sense? Let's keep on going. We'll do the next Mishnah. Interesting Mishnah. Again, as you notice, that the Mishnah keeps on saying Ein Bain, and that's why it started off this whole series of Mishnahs. We started off about this Ein Bain, Oder Rishon and Oder Sheni. That's the way we started off the Mishnah before, and from there we get to the Ein Bain. So the Mishnah. So we're going to talk now about Sforim. Sforim is talking about the Sefer Torah, or Nevi'im Ksuvim. So he says that Ein Bein Sforim, there is no difference between the way we write a Sefer, which is the Torah, as Rashi says, Sforim, which is Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, and the way L'Tfilin u'Mezuzos, and Tfilin u'Mezuzos. We know that Tefillin and Mezuzahs have parchment, they have a part of the Torah in it. So all the requirements, the way we require to write the Torah for Sefer Torah, we also have for Tefillin and Mezuzahs. It has to be Lishmo, you have to write the B'Shem's name, you have to, all the halachas there have to be the same, with one exception. The difference between the Sefer Torah and the Torah Nevi'im Uksuvim, Rashi says, and Tefillah Mezuzahs is Elosha Sforim Nichtovim B'chol Loshen. The Chumash, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Kesuvim, one is allowed to write in any language you want. You want to write it in English, you can write it in English. You can write, when you read this sentence just literally the way it says in the Mishnah, it almost seems like you can put a scroll in the Sefer Torah written in English. But the Mefarshim explained already, we're not talking about a scroll to read from the Sefer Torah, we're talking about a scroll to study from. You want to study from a Sefer Torah. In the olden days, people would study from a Sefer Torah. That's what they would use. So the Sefer Torah, it's Torah Nevi'im Uksuvim, you can write it in whatever language you like. You can write it whatever you like. It's still okay. You're allowed to do that.
So, but it has the halachas.
Tefillin and mezuzahs, the tefillin and the mezuzah, in order for it to be kosher tefillin, in order for it to be a kosher mezuzah, it's a little bit, they don't contrast exactly, it's because by the Sepharim, we're also saying, in order, I just mentioned, the Mefarshim say that in order to be a kosher Sefer Torah, to read from it, it has to be written also in Ashuris, in Lashon Kodesh. But in any event, if you're going to write tefillin, the parchment in the tefillin, or the parchment, the mezuzahs, the writing of the Torah in the tefillin and in the mezuzah, eino nichtavis elo ashuris. They can only be written ashuris. Ashuris, Rashi says, Lashon HaKodesh. That's the holy tongue. Lashon Kodesh, you have to write it in Lashon Kodesh, and that's for tefillin and mezuzahs. But the Torah, if you want to write it in Choloshe, meaning every language, it's okay to write it. There's a dissenting opinion. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Eimer. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says Av v'svarim lo yitiru sheyichtavu elo yivonis. He disagrees with the Tanakama. Svarim can also not be written in every language. The only thing you can write a different language in the Chumah, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, they did not permit Shebi Yichtavu Elo Yevonis, only Greek. A lot of write Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, a lot of write in Greek. As the Gemara will give the reason. Av b'svarim lo yitiru lohem loshen achar. Shimon Wolosow says no. Even with a Sefer Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, the Chachamim did not permit to use any other language, chutz, with the exception of Loshen HaKodesh, exception of Loshen Kodesh. Which one? Elo Yevonis. The only other language they let you is Greek. Elo Yevonis, Gemara Mefarish time. Gemara will explain the reason. Why is the Greek different? It tells us the whole story. Talmud HaMelech, they wanted them to translate the Torah, as we'll see later on in the Gemara. But in any event, so we have here basically a disagreement whether you are permitted to write the Sefer Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, the Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, in all language, which is the opinion of the Tanakhama. And Shimon Gamliel says no, you're only allowed to write it in Greek. But Tefillin and Mezuzahs, they can only be written Ashuris, they can only be written in Loshen Kodesh. All right. So the Gemara says, what do we learn from this? So in other words, we're trying to say that there's something that they are the same. So what aspect are they the same? You're saying there's no difference between them. So in other words, there is some difference, which is that they have to be written in Hebrew, the Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Svarim don't. But with regards to everything else, they're equal. What makes them equal, and what aspect are they equal? So the Gemara says, "Hol l'toifran begidim," and l'tameh sayedai. The Gemara uses two halachas. When you write a Sefer Torah, there's more than one panel. You can't write the whole Sefer Torah in one panel. So what you do is you connect two sheets together. What do you use to get? You sew the Sefer Torah together. You sew them with sinews. That's the way from the animal. You sew them from a kosher animal, you sew them with the sinews. That's the gidim of it. It's a special halacha that we have become by tradition that they have to be the sinews. You can't just take a cotton, a flax, and just sew them together. It has to be gidim. That's by a Sefer Torah. What's about tefillin and mezuzahs? Okay, by tefillin, as far as we know, we don't sew together the parchments. Each one is on its own piece of parchment. But over there, by tefillin, you have to sew up the tefillin, the box. What you use to sew up the box is also sinews, also gidim. And Rashi, we'll see in a second, Rashi actually says mezuzahs, but what is there to sew by mezuzahs? We don't know. What is there to sew? How could we use sinews by mezuzahs? So the Mefarshim explained that Rashi's opinion is that you don't need to have the entire mezuzah on one column. You can write a few columns, the Shema on one and Behoya on the next one, and you can sew it together. The Rambam says you can't do that, but whatever the case is, the Gemara says, since you only made a distinction between the Sefer Torah and Tefillin and Mezuzahs, you said that that you can write them in any language. The Torah and the Tefillin and Mezuzahs need to be, according to the Chavim, need to be only Ashuris. It seems like, but the other halacha that you require Gidim, that you require to sew the sinews, they're the same, because otherwise you would say, this is actually in Gemara, in Maseches Makos, Rashi brings down, it's actually a debate over there in the Gemara, whether there is an obligation. The Gemara debates over there whether there is an obligation to sew together a Sefer Torah specifically with sinews, with Gidim, or you can use something else. So the Gemara wants to learn, since our Mishnah says that it's equal for everything else, that means that our Mishnah holds, but as far as sewing them with veins or with the sinews, they are equal. Which means that Tefillah Mezuzahs and the Sefer Torah, they both require the Gidim to sew them. And the other thing is, Uletame Esayadayim. To make the hands not, to make the hands Tomei. The rabbis decreed that if you touch a Sefer Torah, then your hands, you become Tomei. The rabbis were worried about the respect. They didn't want people to touch the Torah with their bare hands. So they made a halacha that if you touch your bare hands, you will become Tomei, and then you can't eat the truma, and then it's not the chulin becomes Tomei. So the chachamim were goyzer tuma ala yadayim, on the hands. So it seems like the tuma, the gezeda, that is metame the yadayim, that applies to everything, just like it applies to the Sefer Torah, it applies to Tefillah Mezuzahs. So this is what the Gemara is saying. All the Torah from beginning, but as far as sewing them together with the sinews and uletame seyadayim, and to make your hands tamei, zeh side the Sefer Torah and side the Tefillah and the Mezuzahs, shavim are equal. They all need to be used, the sinews, the gidim, and they're all metame the yadayim. So while the Mishnah said that there is a difference, that the Sefer Torah can be written in any language, and Tefillah and Mezuzah is only in Hebrew, but as far as being metame the yadayim, as far as sewing them with sinews, they're both the same. It's not a question, just a statement to teach you. Look at Rashi, the Torah from beginning. To sew it up with the veins. Rashi, Kol Sifreim Asuyin Megillah. All their books were made on a sheet, not like we have it in books, but it's a gillion. We know by tradition, when it comes to tefillin and mezuzahs, that they have to be sewn with the sinews of the gidim. But the Sefer Torah nechleku b'Maseches Makos. With regard to Sefer Torah, there is a disagreement in Maseches Makos. The Sefer Torah shetov Rabbi Pishtan, about a Sefer Torah that you have sewn it with flax, whether it's okay or not. So hashta hashmi'inon mas nisin command the apostle. So here, the Mishnah teaches us like the opinion of the one that says that it's no good, because the Mishnah says there is no difference, and the same laws apply to Tefillah and Mezuzahs, and they apply the same thing to Sefer Torah. So that means that the Sefer Torah needs to be done with the Gidim. But no, Rashi clearly says, Tefillah Mezuzahs she'it for Gidim. So the issue becomes, what does Mezuzahs have to do with Gidim? And that's why I said it looks like the Rashi's opinion is that you can sew together the pieces of the Shema and the Mezuzah, you can sew them together. And if you do, you would need a Gidim, you need the sinews. Okay, let's go weiter. What did the Mishnah say? The Tanakama says that Usforim nichtovim b'choloshim v'chulu. That the Sforim Sefer Torah, Tefillah, Mezuzahs can be written in all languages, etc. But I'll ask you a question. Contradiction from a brisa. You say that it's okay to write a Sefer Torah in every language. I'll ask you a question. Says the brisa, Mikra, the assumption is we're talking about the Chumash. And Mikra that's supposed to be in Hebrew, Sheksavoy Targum. But instead of writing it in Hebrew, he wrote it in Targum, in translation, in Aramaic. Targum means translation, but it means specifically Aramaic. So you have a word in the Torah or in the Nevi'im, the Ksuvim, which is written in Hebrew, and you wrote it, the translation, you wrote Aramaic. Mikvah. So, Mikra shekosove targum. Zokt Rashi, Mikra shekosove targum. Sefer shekosov b'loshen hakodesh. A sefer which is written in Loshen Kodesh, which is basically most of our Sforim, with the exception, as you'll see, like Daniel and Ezra, they're written in Aramaic. So if you have a sefer which is written Loshen HaKodesh, and Haroi Lichte by Mikra, and that which was fit to be written in there in the pasuk in Loshen Kodesh, because occasionally you will find in the pasuk something which is also Aramaic, as we'll see in a minute. But this was fit to writing Mikra, and the person goes and changes it and writes it Aramaic, changes the language of that particular verse. Or the other way around, the Targum Sheksove Mikra. Occasionally you'll have a Targum word in the Sefer, in the Chumash or in the other Sefer, and instead of writing it in Targum, you wrote it Mikra. So Rashi v'Targum, Dr. Shahoya Roi Lichtev Boy Targum. Sometimes within the Sefer, it's fitting to write Targum. Kigoin Yigar Saudosa. So if you take a look in the pasuk, Lavan was chasing after Yaakov. So at the end, they put up a heap of stones. So it says, Vayikra loy Lavan Yigar Sahadusa. The Yaakov Kora loy Gal Eid. Gal Eid means a testimony by the heap. Yigar Sahadusa also means the same thing in Aramaic. So instead of writing Yigar Sahadusa, you will write Vayikra loy Lavan Gal Eid. And the Yaakov Kor loy Gal Eid. I mean, that pasuk wouldn't make sense. But, but the bottom line is, if you're going to write the Targum, if it was fit to be written a Targum there, Kigoin Yigar Sahadusa in the pasuk there, and he Ksove Mikra, instead of writing it Yigar, so he wrote it Gal Eid. That's one example. Or Kigoin Targum Ksav Shel Daniel ve'Ezra. The writing in the Tanakh of Daniel and Ezra is written in Targum. And he went and he translated it, and he went and he wrote in Hebrew. So in this case, it does not qualify as a Sefer Torah, he will say. It does not qualify as a Sefer Torah. Why? Because you can't write it. It has to be written, it would seem, like in Hebrew. That goes against the opinion of the Tanakama. In our Mishnah, he says you can write it in every language. And over here, you see that you can't change it. You can't write the Hebrew in Targum. You can't write the Targum in Hebrew. And there's yet another halacha. Uksav ivri. Sometimes you don't even change the language, but you just change the letters. So in other words, it's the Hebrew language, let's say, but it's spelled out with English words, transliterated, so to speak. So it's a transliteration. So you're saying the Hebrew words, but it's in English. Or in this case, Ksav Ivri. The writing is in Ivri. So it's a Hebrew language. Even that, even if it's in Hebrew, but the writing is in Ivri. In this case, Ivri means from the Ever Hanor, from the other side of the river, Ever Hanor Yeshav Seichem. It's not considered to be a good Sefer Torah, and therefore, Einoi Mitames HaYadayim. It will not be Mitam the Yadayim. It doesn't have the Kedusha of the Sefer Torah. The Chum won't worry if you're going to touch it with your hand, because it doesn't have the Kedusha of the Sefer Torah. This contradicts the halacha of the Mishnah. Let's look Rashi. Uksav Ivri. So Rashi, Oishalei Shino Hasaloshim. He didn't change the language. It's still Lashon Kodesh. Yet it's not going to be good. Avol Shino Saksav. If he only changed the letters, the writing, Sheksavoi Biksav Shel Ever Hanor. He wrote it in the writing of the other side of the river, different alphabet, but it's still the Hebrew language. It's still going to be possible. Seches Sanhedrin Achofalav Amid Beis Korle Kasba Libuno. They refer to it as the Libuno Ksav. So, it's not going to make them a Tamidai. Why? Because it's not really a Sefer Torah. Ad sheyichtevenu b'ksav ashuris. So it gives you the guidelines. It has to be written with ksav ashuris. That's Hebrew language, Hebrew text, everything in Hebrew. It has to be al hasefer, on a parchment. Ubidyoya needs ink. Those are the things that qualify and make it into a Sefer Torah. So that's the Gemara's question. That's our writing. You see, it's not only the language, but it has to be Ksav Ashuris. Those are the Hebrew alphabet that we write. Is Ksav Ashuris. It's a language, a Hebrew language, anyways, but the writing is Ashuris. The Hebrew letters are called the Ksav Ashuris. Those are the Hebrew letters. So that's why we needed both. Not only the language Hebrew, not only talk about Kosovo B'Choloshin, but even if you use Hebrew, but you don't use the letter, it's no good. So this contradicts the Tanakama of our Mishnah, who said that you can write the Sefer Torah B'Choloshin. That's what he said. You can do it in any language. Over here it says it has to be Ksav Ashuris, Allah Sefer, Ubidyoy. And of course, we can't say, well, maybe he's going to write it with Hebrew letters, but he's going to use the English. But that's even worse. If we need a Ksav Ashuris, even the writing, so for sure we need the language. As evidence, as the Gemara said before, as it said, Uksav Ivri says, it seems like that's a lesser level of changing it. But in any event, the contradiction is our Mishnah said you can write a Sefer Torah in any language, and in this rice it says you have to write it in Ksav Ashuris ala Sefer B'Dyoy. Another one I'm trying to say is when he says you have to write it in Hebrew, it includes and in the Hebrew language as well, not only the alphabet, but it's to be in the Hebrew language again, because it started off. He says that you can't write Targum, so it says both in this Braisa. You need the language, you need the writing, you need everything. So how do we reconcile this with our Mishnah? Omar Rava says, Rava Likashi, it's not a question. Let's turn the page to Testament Aleph. Says Rabbi, says the Gemara, Khan. Exactly what I tried to say, the Gemara is actually going to make a difference. Gemara, and actually the Gemara is going to give the Gemara said what we thought. Seems like the Gemara goes through this thinking. First, the Gemara says that the difference is kan begufan shalonu. Here we're talking about, in our Mishnah, kan means our Mishnah, is talking about that the text is ksava shuris, is the text. So what the Gemara is trying to say, when the Mishnah allowed and said you can write it in all languages, it only meant it in a way that it's begufon shalonu, it's our font. The font is the Hebrew font, it's ksava shuris. And over there, it's okay. When the Braisa says that you need to have ksava shuris, yes, he's talking about the font, but if you don't have the right font, so then it's no good. Again, so let's look in the Rashi. Kan begufon the ksiva. Gufon means the ksiva, the writing. Kan begufon shalom. Masnis in the katon ibechol loshin. Our Mishnah that says that you could write that you can write it in all languages, is talking about a situation. He didn't change the Hebrew writing. The text is still the Hebrew. So he used Hebrew text to spell out English words, say, or Hebrew text to spell out another language. That the Mishnah says was okay, because the text writing has to be the Hebrew. And that's why our Mishnah says that it's okay. But Ubraisa, when the Braisa says it needs to be Ksava Shuri, is talking about Begufan Shalahan, is talking about that you're using the text, the writing, using English letters you're using. So over there, that's no good. And that's how we're going to reconcile. So in other words, we still require that it has to be a Sefer Torah, has to have Hebrew letters in there. Whether the writing is Hebrew language or it's another language, that doesn't make a difference. But the text, and that's how we're reconciling. When the Braisa says it has to be the Ksava Shuris, it means that it needs, at least the Hebrew needs to be there. If there's no Hebrew there, then it's no good. So what does it mean in the Braisa, in which it states, if you wrote it Mikra Shekosvei Targum, the Targum Shekosvei Mikra, it says if you write, you change around the Targum, the Mikra, but according to what we're learning now, that wouldn't make a difference. The problem is not the problem is the writing. This Braisa wants you that the writing should be a Ksava Shuris. That's what it wants. It wants the writing to have the Hebrew fonts in there. That's what it wants. But the change of language is not the important case. So when it says that you wrote the Mikra into translation, that you wrote the wrong way, that would mean that you changed both. You changed the font and you changed the Targum. And it's no good. But why is it no good? Is it no good because you changed the language, or it's no good because you have the wrong font? We have to say, according to the Gemara's explanation, it's no good because you have the wrong font, because you don't have Hebrew there. Not because you changed the language. So the Gemara is challenging now his idea. He came up with an idea to make a distinction, to reconcile. But the Mishnah is talking about using Hebrew fonts, other languages. And the Braisa requires to have Hebrew fonts. And that's why it would be no good if you don't have Hebrew fonts. So the Gemara is going to ask, so why is he bringing the case that you wrote the Hebrew in Targum, or you wrote the Targum in Hebrew? Why not say you wrote the Hebrew in Hebrew, but you used the wrong font? That's the issue here. Because you're saying writing in a different language isn't the problem. You're trying to reconcile with our Mishnah. So Abaye says to him, to Rava, who answered it. So he says to him, B'ma yukimto lehahi. How did you translate that Braisa? Begufon shalahen. Though it would be possible. You need ksavashuri. And the reason that it's possible when you wrote Targum Shekosvei Targum, why is it possible? It's because you also changed the font. It's no longer in Hebrew. It's not the language that you're worried about, because you're saying that over there the problem is Guf Shalahen, and that's why they're puzzled. Why does it say Mikra Shekosvei Targum? Is because you used the wrong font. So my area. So why does it make a difference to the Mishnah that Mikra Shekosvei Targum, the Targum Shekosvei Mikra? You're saying it's a case where he wrote the Hebrews into Targum, or he wrote the Targum Hebrew. Afilu Mikra Shekosvei Mikra, the Targum Shekosvei Targum. Even if he writes what's written in Hebrew, he writes in Hebrew, and what's written in Targum, he writes in Targum. Nami, it would also be possible, because we don't care. Because you need it to be written with Ashuris on together with the ink. Okay, so we'll leave it over here. We'll leave it by a question, because it goes on. The debate goes on further. Just want to finish up with something of the parsha, and to know that today is the parsha of Shoftim, and over there the Torah discusses about the laws of a king, and how to treat a king. Special privileges of a king, but the Torah cautions the king, not to indulge. Torah specifically talks about not to get horses, too many horses, because if you get horses, you might want to go down to Egypt. Egypt was, I guess, a place where people bought horses. We see in the Chumash, Sus, Pare, Richbay, the choicest horses. Apparently in Egypt, they had some good horses. The king who won a lot of horses might go back to Egypt. The Torah tells you not to go back to Egypt. So there's a whole discussion whether Egypt today is really the ancient Egypt. We know that the Torah says that you're not allowed to return back to Egypt. The Torah says don't get those horses so you don't bring the people back to Egypt. So the question today, are you allowed to settle in Egypt? The Rambam himself, Maimonides, lived in Egypt. But if you're not allowed to be in Egypt, how did he live there? Okay. Okay, if a person goes for a visit, something maybe that's different, but to live there, Torah says, the Rambam quotes actually from Yerushalmi, from other medrash that says the Torah has warned us in 3 places not to live in Egypt. Now, one can argue that one of the reasons we shouldn't live in Egypt is because the Egyptians were known to be exceptionally promiscuous. The pasuk says, "K'ma'aser Mitzrayim, Ashi Yitzosim Misham, K'ma'aser Canaan." So they were corrupt, morally degraded people. They were very dangerous people to be next to. So you can say that the Torah doesn't want you to live next to those people. But the question is, well, first of all, can those people change over time? Can we really say, like, for example, that these people are better? We got plenty of corrupted nations out there today. I mean, but let's say that is the case. We're saying they were corrupted. The Torah says so. There's a certain corruption that is by the Egyptians. But the question is, are the Egyptians really the same Egyptians? They may live there now in Egypt, but are they really the same Egyptians? And if the Torah doesn't want you to live there because you shouldn't be influenced by the corrupt Egyptians, but if they're not, this is not them, then you should be okay to live in Egypt. Rebbe he points out also there's another Maimonides. Rambam actually says himself that if you Egyptian has special rules. The Torah says that 3 generations after their conversions, they're not allowed to marry into the Jewish community up to 3 generations. So, but the Rambam writes that Sancherib was a king who mixed up the whole world. He mixed up all the nations. And there's actually, we don't know anybody whether they're an Egyptian or not. So it turns out that we don't really know because Egyptians are all nations have been mixed up. But Rebbe goes through a point that there is still some Egyptians left over behind. When Rebbe brought it out, Rebbe used the verse. This was after the 6-day war. When the Jewish people saw great miracles, how we beat the army of the Egyptians. They came with all the tanks and all the soldiers. And it was miraculous above miraculous. And the Rebbe refers to the pasuk that says in the Parshas Yisrael, it says, Hashem says, you saw what I have done to the Egyptians because Atam Reisim, Mitzrayim, and the Eibishter says, Shemoya Tishmu B'Koili, you should listen to my voice. So the Rebbe says that today also, the Rebbe said it at that time, when you see the victory of Hashem, how the Eibishter helps us, so then that should bring about a desire to want to become connected to Hashem even more. So that the Rebbe connected it with the whole idea of Egypt. And I just want to mention also, we just started the month of Elul. Elul is an abbreviation of Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, which means I'm to my beloved is to me, which means it's a time of getting closer to our beloved, to Hashem. It's also a time when Hashem, the Alter Rebbe explains that Hashem goes out to the field. There's a time when the king is in the palace, over there you need special permission to enter, and special preparation. But when the king is in the field, anybody can go and ask, and the king listens. So therefore, the month of Elul, we have the blowing of the shofar every morning. It's a reminder to wake up. We do extra tehillim. We say, L'David Hashem Ori. We do extra chapters of tehillim. Generally, we strengthen ourselves in the 3 pillars that the world stands on, which is Torah, Avodah, Gemilut, Chasadim. And they all have a abbreviation of the month of Elul. Torah, it says in the pasuk, Ina liyodi v'samti loch. I will happen chance to your hand, I played that talks about Ori Miklat, cities of refuge. Torah is considered a city of refuge. It's like when you have problems, you have worries, so you immerse yourself into Torah, and then you forget your problems. Torah is considered to be Ina Liyod V'Samti Loch. It's a Rosh Tevis abbreviation of Elul. We also have, let's see, I think I may have it over here. No. You see, I'm going to hook you up again to. All right, but then you have the same thing is running out of time here, but the same thing is we have another abbreviation which talks about the service of the heart, the davening. It says, Es levavcha ve'es levav. Hashem will circumcise your heart, and the heart is the Rosh Tevis Elul as well. And then finally we have Ish l're'eyu matonas l'vyon. It's pasuk from the Megillah, which talks about charity to the poor. So this is and friendship. So this is all the three areas: Torah, Avodah, and Rulas Chasadim. And Hashem blesses us all with a Ksiva Chesima Tova, Ashana Tova Mesuka, a good year, a sweet year, and everything that we need. Should have only happiness and goodness for all of us. Okay. Till next week, we'll keep it at Wednesday at 6:30. Does that work? Hold on one second.
Next Wednesday, I can't make it.
I turned the speaker off. 1 second. Let me just close this thing down. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I can't make it next Wednesday.
I can't hear you.
Hello?